There we go. So we're going to be talking about shortwave listening today. And by shortwave listening, what I'm talking about here is radio. So when we think of radio, we usually think about public broadcasts and commercial stations. So if someone says radio, you immediately think Radio 1, BBC, LBC, Radio 4, World Service, whatever it is. And each of these stations has got an address. So that address, for example, for Radio 1, you can find Radio 1 on your stereo at home by tuning your radio to 97 to 99 FM. Well, Radio 4 has got a different address, so that's 92 to 95 FM. But they have a particular location, which is called its kind of FM frequency. It's like its address. And the reason it has these different kind of dedicated frequencies is so that it doesn't interfere with other broadcasts. But FM radio transmission only takes up a really small part of the radio frequency spectrum, which is between 88 and 108 megahertz, which is located here in this table. If you can see, it's FM radio in the VHF band. And there are many more bands which house different kinds of radio communication. So if you have a look at this little chart, in between the medium wave radio and the FM radio band, there's a range which is called shortwave radio, which is approximately between 3 and 30 megahertz on the high frequency or the HF band. The great thing about shortwave radio and about this particular band of frequencies is that they can travel extremely long distances. So for example, international radio stations might use shortwave for their broadcasts. The BBC World Service, for example, is a shortwave radio station, but it's also used by the military, for aviation, for marine communications, as well as for international communication between hobbyists who are called amateur radio enthusiasts. So they can transmit messages back and forth over extremely long distances. A little bit of radio history. So the first mode of electrical telecommunication was the telegraph, which was invented by Samuel Morse in the 1830s. And that relied on electrical pulses, which traveled vast distances across dedicated wires and activated a telegraph sounder, which made a click. A series of these long and short clicks became Morse code. So skilled Morse code operators, they don't have an alphabet in front of them. They tend to just be able to hear. They don't get a pen and they write down each letter as, oh, that would have been my approach. But they can just hear this sequence and see words form in their brain. So a skilled Morse code operator could decipher 40 words per minute in that way. So this kind of transmission is called continuous wave, which is CW, continuous wave. And that's the terminology for transmissions which are just a signal that starts and stops, on-off transmissions. So the problem with Morse code and telegraphy, as it was back then, was that telegraphy relied on wires which were strung up on these poles, which crossed vast distances in order to carry communications. So if you have a look at pictures of cities in the late 19th century, then you'll see these huge, huge towers with millions of wires. And of course, if there was to be a storm of some kind, or this structure wasn't sound, if that was to crash, it would cause intense havoc on the city below. So clearly this wasn't the most ideal method of communication. But luckily in 1886, then there was a physicist called Heinrich Hertz who identified and studied radio waves. And he and his predecessor, James Clerk Maxwell, studied radio waves as potential transmitters for wireless telegraphy. Now, within 10 years, Marconi developed radio transmitters and receivers, and radio began to be used commercially around 1900. So that's the end of the history, and on to a little bit of physics. So electromagnetic radiation is all around us in many forms. For example, sunshine is a type of electromagnetic radiation. And radio waves, just like light waves, are also a type of electromagnetic radiation. This is the spectrum of all different kinds of electromagnetic waves. Radio waves have lots of energy, which they transfer from one store to another. But they behave differently to sound waves, because sound waves are longitudinal waves. So in that first diagram at the top, if you can imagine, for example, a slinky kind of moving back and forth, as opposed to transverse waves, which would be like if you were to shake a slinky from side to side. So there are two different kinds of waves. And waves are measured by their frequency, which is the number of cycles. So if you could picture a cycle as a rotation, the amount of cycles that the wave completes in a second. We've got that on this diagram where it says wavelength. Wavelength is the same as one cycle, it's wavelength. So wavelengths are counted in hertz, which is named after our friend Heinrich Hertz. And humans can hear waves that are approximately between 20 hertz and 15 kilohertz. And the higher the frequency, those of you who have studied or are interested in music, then you'll know the higher the pitch. So for example, 15 kilohertz would be an extremely high frequency to us, but it wouldn't be to a bat, because bats emit calls from around 12 kilohertz to 160 kilohertz. So our hearing range is much lower than bats or even dogs, which can hear between 40 hertz and 60 kilohertz approximately, probably depending on the size of the dog as well. And a little bit more about waves. Radio travels between 3,000 and or between 3 kilohertz and 300 gigahertz per second. So these frequencies are divided up into groups or bands. In each band of frequencies, the waves often have different kinds of properties. So some waves can travel longer distances than others. So if you look at each different band, each grouping of waves, depending on their frequency, will have different properties. FM radio, for example, operates in megahertz or a million hertz, and that's in the very high frequency band, so that's here in VHF. So some of the uses for these bands. So UHF, which is ultra high frequency, is used for TV broadcasting, it's used for mobile phones, for satellite communications, GPS, and personal radio services like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Whereas VHF underneath is used for DAB and FM broadcasting. HF is suited to long distance communications. VLF is used for things like government time radio stations, military communications, and submarines. I actually did this project in Barrow where I tried to listen to submarines using VLF. I wasn't very successful, I've got to say, but it was an interesting experiment. And ELF, so these are really, really long waves, and they, because of the way in which they travel, they can reach into very low depths underwater. So if you wanted to communicate with a submarine, if the submarine was right at the bottom of the ocean, then you might send it a signal via ELF radio, just to tell it to rise a little bit up to the next frequency band, so that then you'd be able to send it more detailed communication. So a little bit now about transmission. So radio waves by themselves don't actually carry any audio information. They are, for example, like an empty car that you could load up with audio. And that process is called modulation. So the FM in FM radio refers to the type of modulation, so the type of loading up the radio wave with an audio signal. In order to attach audio signal to a carrier wave, then the carrier wave is moved or oscillated at the same time as the audio signal. If anyone has no idea what I'm talking about when I say oscillated, then please nod or wave at me in your cameras now. I think that's probably the most difficult of all the concepts of this. So we've got our carrier wave, which needs to be loaded up with the audio. And so they are oscillated in time with each other. And the two different kinds of modulation that we have are frequency modulation and amplitude modulation. So in one of them, then the carrier wave is oscillated in time with the amplitude, or in FM in time with the frequency. A bit more about modulation. So a radio frequency oscillator is a device which modulates the wave. So the below block diagram shows the process by which an audio signal moves from a microphone into an audio amplifier, which gains a bit of power. Then it moves into a modulator where it's met by the radio frequencies, which are oscillated or moved in time with the audio signal in order to join them together. These radio frequencies, which are now loaded up with your audio, travel to the radio frequency power amplifier to draw a bit more energy. And finally, they are sent out through an aerial into the world. Once your modulated radio wave has traveled to the device that wants to receive it, then it goes through a process to extract the audio signal from the carrier wave so that it can be understood by your loudspeaker. So your antenna, here in this diagram, will receive the carrier wave and put it through the frequency amplifier just to give it a bit of power, and then it can be demodulated. So then you're left with the audio signal, which can then again get a bit of power through amplification and is sent through your loudspeaker. In digital devices, the same kind of thing happens, except that the modulator would be, the modulation is done by software, and you can use what's called an ADC, or an analog to digital converter, and a DAC, digital to analog converter, in order to help your software to understand what it's receiving. So probably in these times of lockdown, everyone's been talking about bandwidth loads. You know, the bandwidth of my internet is really bad at the moment. Everyone's stealing my bandwidth, etc. So what is bandwidth? It's basically this entire, you can see here in this diagram, where it says kind of, sorry, I've got this little block here in the way. Let's move that. So on this diagram, you can see a line which says carrier. So that is your audio signal. And because as a product of modulation, then your carrier signal is the strongest signal, but your carrier signal also produces two things called sidebands. And that basically is the frequencies either side of your main carrier wave will contain exactly the same audio information as your carrier. They will be two mirrors. However, they only use half the power. And that's where they're really useful in shortwave radio. So for example, what I could do if I was operating a radio which had a low amount of power, then I wouldn't have to use up all my power listening to the carrier and both sidebands in order to retrieve my audio signal. I could just listen to one of the sidebands and I would hear it just as well as if I was as if I was trying to listen to the lower, upper and the carrier all at the same time. So I can really minimize the amount of power that I use by just listening to the upper sideband or the lower sideband. This is called single sideband transmission, or SSB, and it's used a lot in amateur radio. So a little bit now about how radio travels. So there's two different kinds of propagation that I'm going to talk about. Propagation just means how radio waves travel. It means how they travel through, travel across distances. So this is called line of sight propagation. So I've got one antenna on one side. This is the curvature of the Earth. So this is really a great distance. This would be an absolutely massive antenna. It's obviously not the scale. But we've got one antenna and another antenna, and the radio wave is just transmitted in a straight line. The kind of limitations of line of sight transmission or line of sight propagation are that the radio wave can't go beyond the horizon. It can't curve with the Earth. So it's limited to the visual horizon. If you get really tall antennas, then it can go further, but it is limited in that way. So this is called skywave propagation, which is a different kind of propagation. And this is where radio waves can travel beyond the horizon by being bent or refracted thousands of miles off the Earth's ionosphere. The ionosphere is a layer of ionized air, which is about between 70 and 400 kilometers above the Earth. But only high frequency, so that's HF radio waves, can use skywave propagation. Skywave propagation also really depends on some of your external conditions, so things that influence whether or not you can diffract or bend your radio wave off the ionosphere, kind of bounce it off to reach a greater distance, could, for example, vary depending on the weather, depending on the sunspot cycle, depending on the seasons or day or night. And for that reason, it can be quite unreliable. So this is your typical radio ham. Amateur radio is a hobby which is primarily undertaken by men of retirement age it's a technical hobby, and enthusiasts can use an allocated part of the radio frequency spectrum in order to send and receive non-commercial messages. So it's often used for wireless experimentation, for self-training, for fun, and also amateur radio enthusiasts love to have contests where they see how far they can bounce their radio waves off the ionosphere. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second because that's quite a fun part of the hobby. In order to use equipment such as this man here is, so this is a radio ham that I met in Cambridge. He's a member of Cambridge and District Amateur Radio Club, and he invited me to his radio shack. A shack is kind of like, it's just your, the room in your house or outhouse if you're lucky to have one, which is where all of your radio equipment is. Radio hams with gardens often have different kinds of antenna that could stretch and kind of use the shape and the surroundings of their house in order to connect up their equipment to receive the best possible kinds of communications over the longest distances. And this man, Mr. Peter Howell, invited me to his shack and showed me some of his equipment. In order to use this kind of equipment and to be and to play with amateur radio, to transmit messages, then you have to have a license. Now, the reason for this is because if you are trying to transmit and broadcast messages over the radio, then you might interfere with other kinds of communication. So you might, for example, be using a frequency that is reserved for the police, and therefore you might be interfering with their radio broadcasts. So you have to have a special license. I got my foundation license, which means I can now transmit messages and I can use this sort of equipment up to a certain wattage. You can do the course in a weekend. I found it really difficult, and so I have absolutely no baseline knowledge of science, and so it was really starting from scratch for me. But I studied really hard, I got my license, and now I can transmit and receive messages. It's about the difficulty level of a science GCSE, I'm told. So once you get your license, and you can register with Ofcom to get your call sign, and your call sign is like your unique identifier. So my call sign is M7 HKW. M7 signifies that I have a foundation license that is based in England, and then you get to choose 3 letters, provided they're not already used by someone else, following your M7 or M8 kind of beginning prefix. So I chose HKW just because that's my initials. Now, the phonetic alphabet is used quite a lot for clarity when you're making contact over the radio. And that is in order to allow for people to communicate despite them having a really bad signal, for example. You can still, kind of try and repeat things up until you get to understand what their call sign is. So in order to allow for all the different kinds of radio communications to take place across the radio spectrum without disrupting each other, the use of frequency bands are agreed internationally by an agency of the United Nations, and they're called the International Telecommunications Union. And they have a frequency allocation table, which is published on the Ofcom website. And it's a condition of my radio license that I adhere to this, and that I don't broadcast on frequencies outside of those which are allocated to amateur radio. But once I've set up my kit, then I can scroll through the frequencies, and I can try and make contacts with other amateur radio enthusiasts, and those contacts are called QSOs. So, say I was scrolling through the radio frequencies and I wanted to find someone else to talk to, a complete stranger across the other side of the world. So what I would do is I would do what's called a CQ call. So my CQ call would sound something like this. CQ, CQ, CQ. This is M7HKW, that's my unique identifier. Mike 7 Hotel Kilo Whiskey, which is me using the phonetic alphabet to repeat my unique identifier, calling CQ. And hopefully someone would answer and we could have a brief conversation. So for example, M7HKW, this is M7LLL, that's Mike 7 Lima Lima Lima, do you copy? And then I would respond. So we could have a conversation like this. You'll see in this conversation, so I've met someone called Lisa on the airwaves, and Lisa is saying, your report is 5 and 9, 5, 9 over. So the 5 and 9 is a signal report. So the signal report is a way of communicating with each other about how clearly and loudly we can hear each other. So 5 is at the top of the scale for readability, and 9 indicates my signal strength, and 9 is the maximum. Signal reports are often recorded by radio hams on a log sheet. So what an amateur radio enthusiast might enjoy doing is to try and make as many contacts as they can within an hour, or to find people who are the greatest distance away. So maybe the reason that they're communicating with people is not so that they can have a long chat about the weather or the state of the nation, but it's so that they can keep in their logbook, oh, today I spoke to someone in Hawaii and someone else in Antarctica. And it can be quite a great sort of show of pride that you've spoken to someone and that your radio equipment from your Radio Shack has reached that far. People like to swap what's called QSL cards. So these arrive by post. So if you did make contact with someone who is on the South Pole, then you might ask them, please will you post me your QSL card to prove that we have made contact and that my radio equipment has reached all the way to the South Pole. And so you'd give your address over the radio waves, and then you would maybe receive one of these in the post. And people take great pride in their QSL cards, and they like to share them in that way. Just going to check this chat because I'm getting a few messages that are popping up. All right, cool. So in the example before of a conversation, so I've done a CQ call. There is a frequency which on the 2-meter band for shortwave radio is it's 145.5 FM. If I tune my radio to 145.5 FM, then that's called the calling frequency. And the calling frequency is like a center of activity where it's like the metaphorical bar. So if you want to meet new people, then you go to the bar, which is 145.5 FM. And then I put out my CQ call. I say, CQ, 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 is there anyone there who would like to make contact with me? But then as soon as I have made contact with someone, if I'd like to have a longer conversation with them, then I need to leave the bar because I'm basically blocking the bar and no one else can get a drink. So what I would do is I would say M7 Lima 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 to my friend Lisa, who I've just met on the radio. Would you like to have a longer conversation? If so, let's meet on another frequency. And then we would decide on another frequency, and then I would leave 145.5, and Lisa would leave 145.5, and we would meet on 145.25, for example. And that would be where we congregate in order to have our longer conversation. And then we can use that frequency to talk for as long as we want. But 145.5 is the bar where people meet. And so we don't want to prevent other people from using that in order to make their CQ calls. Often communications in this way are quite short. It's mostly people who are trying to make contacts and then they want their signal report, they'll write down their signal report and then they'll move on to the next person. But some people make lifelong friendships in this way. So when I spoke to Peter Howell, who was in the previous picture in Cambridge in his Radio Shack, he told me about friendships that he had had for 20 years or more with people who he had never met, but who lived in really amazing places. And he talked about amateur radio as really a kind of, as a hobby for people who are often quite socially isolated and how it could really be a lifeline for people. And when I've been listening through and making contacts with people on the radio waves, I've primarily been speaking to older men, and some of them have been really enthusiastic about hearing a young woman on the air and said that they haven't had any conversations with anyone my age in a long time. And they've also, some of them like to play fun and games. So for example, I met a man who every year there is apparently a day called Annual Yorkshire Pudding Day. And on Annual Yorkshire Pudding Day, he transmits a recipe again and again and again. So he does a CQ call and he says, is anyone there? And then he tries to give people this recipe. And then he writes down every year how many people he's managed to give his recipe to. So that's his kind of way of interacting with this as a style of communication. This guy, Peter, who I was talking to, said that he had made a friend who lived in Finland in a forest in a very snowy area where for 4 months out of the year he wasn't able to leave leave his house because of all the snow and possibility of avalanches and things like that. So this man spends 4 months out of the year in complete isolation from the world. And he uses amateur radio as a way to connect with others and to keep up that social contact. And so, you know, you can probably hear from how my presentation has changed to talk about the physics that I feel really uncertain about and is not my area, to now that I've passed my exam and I actually get to do the fun part, which is talking to people. And investigating these social communications with others is really where my heart lies. And so, you know, I see this kind of tool of using radio as a means to an end. And I also see great scope for creative collaborations that could stretch worldwide. You know, the kind of scope for creative projects, being able to contact strangers all over the world, which is absolutely immense. One of the things, so I ran this workshop as a kind of trial run last weekend for another Soundcamp project. So as part of Soundcamp, there's been a commission of Public Works, who are a kind of radical architecture collective. And Public Works have convened what they call the April School. So there were 30 people signed up to the April School, and we met every week online, and we talked about structures and different ways of collaborating with people across great distances. So I ran a workshop about listening to shortwave radio with this group, and then we, as a product of that, a kind of working group formed, which was me and 4 other women. I don't know why all women, that was accidental, but, you know, pleasant surprise. But we convened a working group talking about shortwave radio, and we created a sort of a piece together where we all at the same time listened and scrolled through the frequencies and recorded little snippets of things that we could find over the airwaves. So we listened out and we could hear communications between submarines, and we recorded that, and we heard CQ calls by amateur radio enthusiasts all over the world, and we recorded some of that. We heard radio stations from Japan, from China, from the USA, and we recorded some snippets of that. And together, we kind of constructed this collaborative audio piece just from things that we heard on the radio together during that particular time span. What I love about amateur radio and listening to shortwave radio is that you never know what you're going to hear, because of the way that the propagation works as well. You know, what might sound like a crystal clear signal and a nice channel of communication one day, you then want to share it with someone, and 2 hours later, it's gone. It's disappeared off into the sort of radio ether. And so it's highly unpredictable, and there's kind of this sort of temporality about it, where you feel like you stumbled upon something and you have that moment to capture it, because you don't know where it's going to disappear to after that. So with this in mind, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to take us to a WebSVR platform. So SVR stands for Software Defined Radio. So what WebSVR allows us to do is, without having a kind of radio transmitter or transceiver, so without having to have an antenna stuck to my house and a little box to receive radio signals, then someone else, in this case, the University of Twente, which is up in the Netherlands, they have got that equipment, but they have routed it into a computer. So then we are able to listen to the radio communications that are going through their antenna into a box, but we are more than that. We're able to see the entire frequency spectrum and scroll ourselves as though we had a little radio tuning device. So we're going to be able to have a little look at that now together. So here we have, this is what you would land on as a front page if you use this particular. There's lots of different WebSVR platforms. I particularly like this one, but in your toolkit, which I sent you the link to at the beginning of the session, and I'll send you a link to again, that toolkit will provides a whole list of different links to different WebSVR platforms. And so you can decide which one is your favorite yourself. So we've got a bit of blurb here, we've got some techie pictures. It all looks quite off-putting to me as someone who isn't used to this kind of a format. But the important part here is what we call the waterfall display. So can you see here, we have these kind of yellowish white lines on a purple backdrop. The yellowish white lines, amazingly, are actually audio signals. So those audio signals that are being broadcast at the moment live in real time. Along here, along this black band, we've got a series of numbers. Those numbers denote frequencies. So literally you've got the radio frequency spectrum here, or a portion of it. We've got a bit more than just shortwave here. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to use these little tools here. This one is called Waterfall Zoom. So this is my waterfall display, and it's telling me that I can zoom in here. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to zoom in. Now you can start to see, for example, here it says 19-meter broadcast. So it's telling me that that is a band here. And here it says 20-meter licensed amateurs. So here on the broadcast band, I'm likely to hear commercial radio stations. And here on the amateur band, I'm likely to hear people's CQ calls. Over here, I've got this little yellow marker. So this denotes where I am. This is me and what I'm listening to. So if I drag it along somewhere here, then I'm going to be able to hear hear an audio signal. Now I'm going to turn my audio on by unclicking mute, but I'm just going to turn the volume really low to make sure that I don't deafen any of you, especially those of you who are wearing headphones. Okay, it's probably, I'm not going to lie to you, this is not going to sound good to start off with. It's going to sound very noisy before we actually manage to scroll through and find a good clear signal. I'm just going to unmute for a minute. Let's see, what can we hear? There we go, I'm just zooming in some more. So we can hear something very unclear at the moment. Now, what it's telling me is that here I've got a radio station, which is called China Radio International. So what I would want to do is I would scroll around here and put my cursor probably bang in the middle. Now I'm just going to mute myself whilst I explain a few more of these controls. So here in this little control in the corner, firstly, it tells me here, what frequency am I currently listening to? So here I'm listening to 15410 kilohertz. So that's quite high up. And here I've got a few little acronyms, but we've covered all of those in our radio physics basics. So CW was continuous wave, so that is Morse. Morse code usually hides down the bottom of the radio frequency spectrum. That's where Morse code operators often transmit. And so if I was listening for some Morse code, then I would choose CW. I would be listening for continuous wave transmissions. Here I've got AM, so I'd be listening for AM transmissions, and here FM. Now what you might have noticed if you were looking at this little yellow band here, is that AM is a smaller bandwidth than FM. So here I can have a little listen to see if this is an AM transmission. You can also see USB and LSB. So do you remember when we were talking about our sidebands or bandwidth? People who want to broadcast using a smaller amount of power, they get rid of the carrier wave and they just listen to one of the sidebands, so either upper sideband or lower sideband. So if you have a look here at my yellow cursor, now if I go FM, then I've got something which is wide and in the middle. So I've got my carrier wave here, which is my middle line. That's my carrier, that's where I'm going to be listening for my carrier wave. And then I've got lower sideband here and upper sideband here. Now, if I switch to upper sideband, then you'll see my carrier wave. A little bit has stayed in the same place. And then I've just got this little section, which is where I'm listening for just the upper sideband. And if I click switch to lower sideband, then it does the reverse. So here, because this is radio, like a radio broadcast, then I am more likely to be able to hear a clear signal using AM or FM. So I'm going to unmute myself and see if I can hear a clearer signal now.
2研究院国际市场所副所长白宁认为，要让企业转向国内市场，首先要重新认识国内市场的环境。作为企业来说呀，那你要想进入这个国内市场。
There we go. So you can see that we could hear a lovely clear signal there on China Radio International. So the joy of listening using WebSVR is that now what I can do is I can scroll around looking for these little white lines to see where is there an audio transmission and trying to have a look for it. So here you can already see that all of these little orange things are popping up. These orange labels tell me if there is a particular broadcast or commercial radio station that is operating on that frequency regularly. So then I can have a little scroll through and I can listen to radio in Germany or radio in America or radio in China. have a little listen to all these different things. But I might want to have a listen out for example, amateur radio enthusiasts instead. So in that case, I might go over here to the 20-meter licensed amateur band, and I might have a little listen here and see if I can hear a CQ call. So the scope for this is pretty endless in terms of what I could be listening for. Let's have a little listen to see if anything is going on over here. Now you can see that the signals are much less strong. They seem to be coming and going here. Let's see what we can hear. Now we can't hear anyone's voices, so I'm going to guess, looking at these, that this is people who are using data modes. So data modes are a kind of radio, it's a kind of transmission, which is a computer which is sending my sort of coded message, usually a very short coded message, depending on the kind of data mode that I'm using, to other amateurs. So a nice way in order to, so you could spend all day, every day, just scrolling through, listening to see what's happening on these waves. But sometimes you can spend a good 10 minutes looking for stuff in a band and not really hear anything that you find particularly interesting. And therefore, what's really useful on this here site is to look at the logbook. So this is where other people who have been scrolling through all these frequencies give their advice. So for example, this person here from France is saying that they are currently doing a calling contest. So they're trying to make as many CQ calls as possible, and they'll get points for how many good contacts they make in an hour or something like that. And they're directing us to the frequency band where that's taking place. So here, what I can do is I can copy and paste this frequency up here and have a little listen and see if anything's happening there. Let's see if we can hear their contest. Oh. So with a bit of scrolling around, if I was to spend a bit of time on it, then maybe I'll be able to find a clearer signal. But maybe because of the way the propagation goes, that signal just isn't going to be very clear for me today. But what you could hear there is some people who are having an amateur radio contest who are all very quickly from all over the world trying to contact each other. If you can see from the image here, it doesn't look like a very clear signal. It's a bit of a murky yellow line rather than a kind of strong, consistent one. So this is a really nice place to look, to experiment with the different frequencies that people are advertising. You know, someone here is saying that that the Israeli Air Force is using this particular frequency, so you can go and have a listen to that. Someone else is doing a test. Someone's saying there's a nice signal here on this frequency. And you can also chat with people and ask them what they've found. A nice feature of this particular site is that you can audio record the sounds that you find. So here it's got a little feature, it just says start recording, and then it will just download it straight to your computer as an MP3. So that can be really nice if you're having a listen to the amateur radio waves. So really, there's lots of different, there's so much scope here for listening to interesting things. You know, down the bottom of the band, as I said, you could listen to telegraphy and Morse code. You can try and decipher some of the codes that you hear. But also, you know, I think that listening to WebSVR is a really great introduction to amateur radio and to all the different kind of creative possibilities of radio. And I hope that it makes you feel enthusiastic about maybe taking the amateur radio exams and being able to transmit things yourself. I've included a huge amount of information and really step-by-step instructions in the resource I've produced for Soundcamp about shortwave listening. And so anything that I've said today and much more and in greater detail and with links is all included in that pack. But I'm going to stop there and just leave a few minutes for questions if anyone happens to have any.